High above the gray clouds of northern France, the B-17 Heaven's Door cut through the icy air like a wounded bird still determined to fly. Frost rimmed the cockpit glass, and the engines drummed their constant, deafening rhythm. 4 hearts of steel beating against time. Inside, 10 young men held their breath between a burst of flak. The sky was alive with black explosions. Each one bloomed like ink spreading across a page. Captain Robert Hayes gripped the controls, his leather gloves stiff with cold. The oxygen mask pressed hard against his face, and his eyes, red from sleepless nights, searched the horizon. "Formation holding," came the voice of Lieutenant Bennett, the navigator. "Target 2 minutes out." Hayes nodded. He didn't need to answer. Every man on board knew what 2 minutes meant. It was the space between life and whatever waited beyond the clouds. Behind him, the intercom crackled again. "Tail clear so far," Sergeant Cole reported from the rear turret. "But they're coming. I can see them forming up. Messerschmitts, maybe 8 or 9. "Copy that," Hayes replied. "Stay sharp." Through the small pane of the cockpit window, he could see them, tiny specks in the distant sunlight, growing larger. Fighters, fast. "Bomb bay doors open," shouted Ellis, the bombardier, his voice steady though his hands trembled. The bomber shook as the doors yawned open beneath him. Wind tore through the belly of the plane. Then came the flak. Closer now, louder. One burst rocked the entire fuselage, throwing Bennett against his map table. "I'm good," Bennett shouted back, clutching his bleeding temple. "Just a scratch." "Hold steady," Hayes called. His voice was calm, but his pulse hammered. He could feel Heaven's Door fighting him, pulling against the stick, as if the plane itself knew what lay ahead. Ellis took a breath and squinted through his Norden bomb sight. On target, on target. Bombs away. The load released. The plane leapt lighter into the sky. A moment later, the world below erupted. Factories, rail yards, and smoke columns rising like dark ghosts. "Let's bring her home," Hayes said. But the radio came alive with panic. "Bandits! 10 o'clock high!" The German fighters struck. Tracers ripped through the sky like fiery threads. The top turret roared in reply. The crew's shouts mixed with the metallic shriek of bullets tearing through aluminum. One enemy fighter burst into flame and spiraled down, but another streaked past, firing. The windshield cracked. Fragments sprayed Hayes' cheek. "Left engine hit," yelled Martin, the engineer. "Feather it," Hayes barked, forcing the bomber into a shallow dive. The smoke trail stretched behind them, marking their path across a dying sky. For the next 7 minutes, they fought for survival, turning, climbing, diving, every motion a gamble. When at last the radio reported, "Fighters breaking off," no one cheered. They were alive, but barely. Hayes glanced at the empty seat beside him, where a shell fragment had punched through the co-pilot's harness. The chair was shredded, but by miracle its occupant had ducked seconds before. "Thanks, Red," Hayes muttered under his breath, thinking of the fighter escort somewhere above. His friend Captain Red McAllister, flying cover. The intercom buzzed weakly. "Skipper," Bennett said, his voice hoarse, "that makes mission number 11. Hayes exhaled, long and slow. "Yeah," he said, 11. The engines coughed and sputtered as Heaven's Door limped across the English Channel. One propeller spun unevenly, a thin trail of smoke curling behind the wing. The hum of the engines, once a proud anthem of strength, now sounded tired like the heartbeat of a wounded giant. Inside the fuselage, the crew worked in silence. Every man knew the unwritten rule: speak only when necessary. Words felt too fragile here, too light to hold the weight of what they'd just survived. Sergeant Cole, the tail gunner, pressed a hand against his ribs. His oxygen line was torn, and every breath felt like ice. But he said nothing. He'd seen worse. Men who hadn't made it past the first mission. Lieutenant Bennett sat slumped over his maps, tracing their course with shaking fingers. His pencil dragged uneven lines across the paper, stained with blood from the cut on his forehead. 20 minutes to base, he murmured, if the wind holds. "Wind's the least of our problems," muttered Martin from the top turret, left engines running on prayers. Captain Robert Hayes heard him but didn't answer. His eyes stayed fixed on the horizon. Through the smudged windshield, he could see England, faint blue-gray hills just beginning to emerge from the mist. Home, or something close to it. He thought of how quiet it always was after a mission, that eerie calm where fear had nowhere left to go. It wasn't victory they felt. It was relief, a temporary kind of peace that never lasted long enough. The radio crackled. Base to heaven's door. You're clear for approach. We've got you on radar. Welcome home, boys. Hayes exhaled slowly. He eased the controls, guiding the battered plane down toward the runway at RAF Bassingbourn, their home field. As they descended, the cold gray sky gave way to the faint warmth of afternoon light breaking through clouds. It looked almost like hope. The landing was rough. Tires screamed, metal groaned, and for a moment, the plane skidded sideways before straightening. When they finally stopped, no one moved. The crew sat frozen, listening to the engines tick down into silence. Then came the soft click of buckles, the rustle of flight jackets. One by one, the men climbed out into the open air. The wind smelled of fuel and grass. Around them, other bombers were landing, some limping, some barely holding together, but others never returned. Empty spaces on the tarmac told their own stories. A jeep pulled up beside them. Major Simmons, their operations officer, stepped out, clipboard in hand. "Hayes," he said, "good to see you made it back. We lost 3 ships over Calais." Hayes removed his flight cap, running a hand through his sweat-matted hair. 3, he repeated quietly. His eyes drifted toward the runway, toward the spaces where the missing planes should have been. Simmons nodded. "You boys get some rest. Debriefing at 1800. As the jeep drove off, Hayes turned toward his crew. They stood together in silence, men bound by something deeper than words. Bennett gave a faint smile. 11 missions, he said again. 9 more, and we go home. But even as he said it, they all knew. The math of war never worked out cleanly. 9 could become 1. 1 could become none. Survival was never guaranteed. That night after the debriefing, Hayes sat alone in his barracks, staring at a photo tucked into his logbook. His wife, Claire, smiling in the summer light of Kansas. The war had aged him beyond his years, but her face remained untouched by time. He wrote a few words beneath her picture. "Still flying. Still here. The sky hasn't taken me yet." Outside, the roar of departing bombers echoed through the darkness. Another squadron, heading east into the night. Hayes looked up through the barracks window. The stars were bright and cold, like distant lanterns guiding lost souls home. The airfield slept under a thin blanket of fog. Searchlights stood motionless, their beams pointed at nothing now. The thunder of engines had faded, replaced by a silence so heavy it felt sacred. Inside the narrow wooden barracks, Captain Robert Hayes sat on the edge of his bunk. The room smelled of oil, smoke, and sweat, the scent of war. Around him, the rest of the crew lay in their bunks, half asleep, half awake, each lost in his own thoughts. On the wall above Hayes's head hung a small pin-up photo, curling at the edges. Beneath it, a list of names was scrawled in pencil. Crews who had flown their last. Some had gone missing over the channel. Others simply never made it back. Every morning, someone quietly drew a line through another name. Hayes watched as the first light of dawn crept through the cracks in the wooden walls. He thought of how strange it was to live knowing that each sunrise could be your last. And yet, when the alarm sounded, every man still rose, still dressed, still climbed back into the sky. He opened his flight log. The pages were stained and wrinkled, but he wrote anyway. Mission 11, Calais Rail Yard. 2 enemy fighters confirmed destroyed. Left engine out. Crew safe. Weather, clear but unforgiving. He paused, pen hovering. Then he added a line he'd never written before. It feels like the sky remembers us, even when no one else will. From the bunk across the aisle, Bennett stirred. You ever wonder, he said quietly, how many of them we really hit down there? How many people were in those factories? Hayes didn't look up. I try not to, but you do. A long silence followed. Outside, a distant siren wailed. Not for danger, but for another mission briefing beginning before sunrise. Bennett sat up, rubbing his eyes. 11 down, he said. 9 to go. Hayes looked at him. You believe in that? Bennett shrugged. You have to believe in something. From the far end of the barracks, the door creaked open. Sergeant Cole stepped inside, his face pale under the dim light. He carried 2 tin cups of coffee, thick, black, bitter. Mess says good morning, he muttered, handing one to Hayes. Hayes took it, the heat burning his cold hands. "You sleep at all?" he asked. Cole gave a faint grin. "Sleep's a luxury, Skipper. I just wait for the next sunrise." They drank in silence. The sound of boots outside grew louder. Ground crew preparing planes, checking engines, refueling for another mission. The war never stopped. It only paused long enough for men to remember they were still alive. At 600, a jeep rumbled past, its headlights cutting through the fog. A voice shouted, "Briefing in 10 minutes! Let's move!" Bennett sighed and pulled on his jacket. "Guess that's our cue." Hayes nodded but didn't stand right away. He looked once more at the picture of his wife, then tucked it carefully into his jacket pocket. As he walked out into the cold morning air, the roar of engines began again, a sound both familiar and terrifying, like the voice of the sky calling them back. The crew climbed aboard Heaven's Door once more. The sun broke over the horizon, painting the runway in gold. Hayes placed his hand on the throttle, feeling the vibration of life beneath him. "Let's go meet the dawn," he said. The bomber surged forward, wheels lifting from Earth into the endless, waiting blue. And just like that, another day began. At 20,000 feet, the sky was a thin, fragile line between life and death. The bomber formations looked like slow-moving giants, vast, heavy birds dragging black smoke across the heavens. Around them, darting and circling like hawks, flew the slender silhouettes of the P-51 Mustangs, the guardians of the sky. Captain Red McAllister flew at the edge of the formation, his Mustang Iron Saint painted with a streak of crimson across its nose. The sun flashed off his wings as he banked left, scanning the horizon for any glint of enemy metal. Behind the oxygen mask, his breath came slow and steady, controlled, measured. He had learned long ago that fear was just another kind of fuel. To most on the ground, the fighter pilots were legends, fearless men dancing with death. But the truth was quieter, lonelier. Their job wasn't glory, it was protection. They were the invisible hands shielding the lumbering bombers from the teeth of the enemy. On this morning, the mission was the same as always. Escort the heavy bombers deep into German territory, keep them alive, and bring as many home as possible. Simple orders, impossible odds. McAllister's voice crackled over the radio. "Eagle Group, tighten up. We've got company. 3 o'clock high, closing fast." Below him, the formation shifted. B-17 ER, like Heaven's Door, held their course, oblivious to the fighters streaking toward them from the sun. McAllister could see the silver flash of Messerschmitts in dive formation, slicing through the sky like knives. He pushed his throttle forward. The Mustang roared. The world narrowed to the gun sight and the scream of wind over aluminum. He fired once, short, controlled bursts. One enemy fighter spun out, smoke trailing from its wing. Another came in low, firing wildly. McAllister rolled, inverted, and came down behind him, the tracers glowing red through the clouds. Seconds later, the German plane vanished into the ground far below. When the sky finally cleared, McAllister looked down. The bombers were still there, damaged but flying. Among them, he spotted the familiar shape of Heaven's Door. Relief washed over him like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. He keyed the mic again. "Formation secure. You're clear, boys. Bring 'em home." But as his eyes swept across the horizon, he saw one B-17 burning, trailing smoke and descending slowly. 3 parachutes opened, then 4, then no more. He said nothing. In war, silence became a kind of prayer. As the group turned back toward England, McAllister stayed high above, circling until the last bomber crossed the channel. Only then did he turn for home. Back at base, he landed alone. The roar of his engine faded into the emptiness of the airfield. Ground crew rushed forward, but McAllister didn't speak. He climbed out, helmet under one arm, eyes fixed on the distant line of bombers touching down one by one. He counted each one silently. It was a ritual, a tally of survival. Every plane that landed meant 10 more men had cheated death for another day. Everyone missing meant 10 stories abruptly ended. That night, in the dim light of the ready room, McAllister poured a small cup of coffee, cold, bitter, untouched. He looked at the board on the wall, covered with flight numbers and call signs. Beside several of them, red chalk lines had been drawn. He didn't have to ask what they meant. He closed his eyes for a moment and whispered to himself, "You did your job. That's all any of us can do." But even as he said it, the weight of the empty sky settled on him again. The war in the air was more than machines and missions. It was trust, the kind forged between men who might never meet, yet whose lives depended on each other every single day. Captain Robert Hayes and Captain Red McAllister had never shaken hands. They'd never shared a drink in the officers' mess or stood side by side in a photograph. But every time Heaven's Door lifted from the runway, Hayes knew McAllister was somewhere up there, watching, guarding, flying cover in the endless blue. The bomber crews called them the Angels. The fighter pilots just called them the Boys. Each mission began with a ritual of silence. The bombers lumbered skyward, heavy with death, and the fighters climbed to meet them, fast, elegant, untethered. Above the gray clouds, the two groups merged into one heartbeat of courage. From his cockpit, Hayes often caught glimpses of the tiny fighters glinting in the sun, streaking ahead to chase down danger before it could reach them. He never saw their faces, but he knew their bravery. Each time they returned from a mission alive, he whispered a quiet thank you to the empty sky. At the same time, high above and far ahead, McAllister would look down at the slow-moving bombers and think of them as the backbone of the war. The reason he flew, the reason he risked everything. He'd often spot Heaven's Door by the faint scorch mark on her left wing, the scar she'd carried since Calais. It was how he knew Hayes's ship from the rest. They became, in a way, invisible brothers, one carrying the bombs, the other carrying the burden. Between missions, the base mail system began to carry small notes, unsigned, passed from the bomber fields to the fighter stations through the chaos of war. They weren't orders, they were lifelines. One evening, Hayes received a letter written on creased paper, smudged with oil and coffee stains. It read, "To the crew of Heaven's Door. You probably don't know me, but I fly with the 357th. We're the ones above you, keeping the wolves away. I've watched your bird limp home more than once. You've got guts, boys. Keep her flying. From a friend in the sky." Hayes smiled faintly when he read it. He pinned the letter above the navigation table. The next morning before takeoff, he wrote back, "To our friend above, we see you up there, and we know what you do. You've saved our skins more times than we can count. If we make it home when this is over, drinks are on us. The crew of Heaven's Door." For months, those quiet messages passed through the airfields, folded into ration boxes, tucked into mission reports, or slipped to courier pilots who carried them like secret treasures. In a world where everything could vanish in seconds, those letters reminded them they weren't alone. Each time Hayes's crew went up, McAllister was there, sometimes ahead, sometimes above, sometimes just a glint in the sun. And each time McAllister flew cover, he found himself glancing down, searching for that battered B-17 with the scar on her wing, making sure she was still alive. They never spoke over radio. They didn't need to. The language of flight was enough. In the endless chaos of war, the sky was their meeting place, their chapel, their home, their graveyard. By the winter of 1944, the missions grew longer, the losses heavier. New crews came and went, names erased and rewritten on chalkboards. But Heaven's Door still flew, and Red McAllister still guarded her. One evening, after a brutal run over the Ruhr, McAllister landed to find a single note waiting on his bunk. It was short, scrawled in pencil, barely legible. "Still flying, still here. Hayes." McAllister stared at it for a long time. He folded it carefully, tucked it into the breast pocket of his flight jacket, and whispered, "Stay that way, buddy. Just stay that way." February 1945. The war was changing. Faster, colder, deadlier. The Allies had pushed deep into Germany, but the skies above were still a graveyard. The missions were longer now, the flak heavier, the enemy desperate. That morning, the bombers rolled down the runway under a bruised sky. Heaven's Door was among them, patched, worn, but still flying. In the fighter wing across the airfield, Captain Red McAllister fastened his harness, gloved hands trembling just slightly. He'd been flying combat for nearly 2 years. By all odds, he should have been dead 10 times over. But he wasn't. Not yet. He glanced at the folded note in his breast pocket. Hayes's message, still flying, still here. He smiled faintly, closed the canopy and whispered, Let's make sure you stay that way. The engines screamed. The Mustangs leapt into the dawn. The target that day was Dresden. The air was clear, too clear. It meant the flak would find them. It always did. By the time the formation reached German airspace, the sky was already alive with black bursts. The bombers held tight, rows of silver crucifixes crossing the clouds. Above and around them, the Mustangs danced, slashing, diving, rolling, shielding their slower brothers from the firestorm. McAllister spotted Heaven's Door almost immediately. The scar on her left wing was darker now. The metal burned and twisted from too many near deaths. But she flew steady, as always. Then from the east came the swarm. 20, maybe more, enemy fighters. FW190S and Me-109S. Faster, furious, desperate to stop the bombers before they reached the city. The sky exploded with motion. McAllister's voice came through the radio. "Eagle Group, break and engage." He dove. The Mustang roared to life beneath him, tracers slicing past his canopy. He fired short, controlled bursts. 1, 2, 3 hits. Another German fighter spiraled into smoke, but there were too many. He pulled hard into a climb, rolled, and dove again, catching a glimpse of Heaven's Door below. Flak tore through her fuselage. Smoke poured from her right engine. The bomber wobbled, falling out of formation. "Heaven's Door, you're trailing fire," McAllister shouted into the radio. "You've got fighters on your 6. Hold tight, I'm coming." He dove straight into the chaos. The air was a storm of steel. Bullets cracked past his wings. He lined up a German fighter closing on the bomber's tail. Fired once, direct hit. The enemy plane disintegrated into flame. But another swooped in low, unseen. A burst of gunfire slammed into Iron Saint's wing. Warning lights flared across McAllister's cockpit. "Mayday, hit, controls sluggish." He wrestled the stick, eyes flicking between his instruments and the burning bomber ahead. He could eject, save himself, but he didn't. Instead, he dove again. One last time, chasing away the fighters clawing at Heaven's Door's tail. His guns roared until the barrels smoked, until his ammunition ran dry. When the final enemy broke off, McAllister's Mustang was trailing thick, black smoke. He steadied his plane long enough to see Heaven's Door limp westward, losing altitude but still flying. Hayes's voice crackled faintly over the open radio line. "You're hit, Red. Bail out." "That's an order." McAllister smiled behind his mask. "Negative, Skipper. You've got 9 lives to get home. I've done my job." The Mustang's left wing buckled. The plane rolled violently. McAllister fought it, but the horizon spun faster and faster. "Tell the boy," he whispered, "the sky's yours now." The radio went silent. Moments later, Iron Saint disappeared into the clouds, a trail of fire fading into the horizon. When Heaven's Door finally landed in England, she came in on one engine, wheels scraping the earth. The crew stumbled out in silence, faces gray, eyes hollow. Hayes stood on the runway, staring toward the eastern sky, the direction his friend had vanished. A courier approached him a few days later, holding an envelope recovered from McAllister's effects. Inside was an unsent letter, dated 2 weeks earlier. In it were just 3 lines. "If I don't make it home, tell the boys I saw them through. Tell them to keep flying, and tell Hayes he owes me that drink." Hayes folded the paper carefully, slid it into his flight log, and whispered, "I will, Red. I promise." By the spring of 1945, the war in Europe was nearing its end. But for the men who flew the endless missions, who lived and died above the clouds, peace didn't come with the silence. It came with ghosts. Major Robert Hayes sat alone in the mess hall that April morning. Outside, the English rain fell soft against the tin roof, a sound that once meant nothing. Now it echoed like the heartbeat of every man who didn't come home. Around him, the tables were half empty. Some pilots had gone back to America. Some were still missing over Germany, and some would never be found at all. Hayes turned the small folded letter in his hand, read McAllister's final note, the one he kept close through every flight. The paper was worn thin now, the ink fading. But those words, "Tell the boys the sky's theirs now," had burned themselves into his mind. He whispered quietly, "You kept your promise, Red. We made it home, but it doesn't feel like home anymore." After the last mission, after the last bomb fell, they all thought life would return to normal. But how could it? How could a man step out of the clouds and walk calmly into a world that had never seen what he'd seen? The smell of oil and gunpowder haunted their clothes. The sound of flak still cracked through their dreams. And when they closed their eyes, they didn't see safety. They saw the faces of the men who didn't make it back. Every pilot carried something invisible. Some carried guilt, the guilt of surviving when their best friends didn't. Others carried silence, a silence that stretched for decades, unspoken between them and the world that called them heroes. But they never saw themselves that way. They were just boys once. Farm kids, mechanics, dreamers, turned into steel and smoke by a war too big for anyone to understand. In the spring of 1946, a memorial was built near the old airfield. The surviving members of Heaven's Door gathered for the first time since the war ended. They stood in silence before a wall of names. Friends, brothers, ghosts. Hayes stepped forward and placed Red McAllister's letter beneath a simple brass plaque. The wind caught the edge of the paper, fluttering it gently, as if the sky itself were breathing. He looked up, eyes wet, and whispered, "You didn't die up there, Red. None of you did. You're still flying." And for a brief, fleeting second, the sound of distant engines rolled through the clouds, soft, fading, eternal. Years passed. The war ended. The world moved on. But for those who survived the skies, the war never truly left. It lingered in quiet corners of their lives, in the way they flinched at thunder or paused at the sight of a contrail stretching across the blue. Every sound of an engine overhead brought back the same thought. Is that him? Is that Red, still flying somewhere above it all? By the time the 1960s came, few of them were left. Hayes grew old, his hair silver, his hands still steady. Pilot's hands. He never flew again after the war, not professionally, but sometimes at dawn, he'd drive out to the empty airstrip, stand at the fence, and watch the sunrise. To anyone else, it was just the sun. To him, it was the same light that used to paint the cockpits gold, just before they took off for another mission that might have been their last. He'd close his eyes and hear McAllister's voice, laughing, confident, fearless. And he'd whisper, "We made it, old friend. We made it." War ends, but for the ones who fought it, it never truly does. The American pilots of World War II didn't just fight the enemy, they fought the sky itself. They lived between life and death, in the thin, freezing air, where courage met fear, and where friendship became the only thing stronger than fire. Many came home, but a part of them always stayed up there, forever circling in the endless blue, guarding the men they once called brothers. And if you look up on a quiet morning, when the clouds drift slow and silver, you might just hear them, the faint hum of propellers, the whisper of names lost to time, the sound of heroes who never stopped flying.